Dr. Γκαρσία, on behalf of the Atheist Union of Greece, I welcome you to Athens. Recently, I have seen many of your videos and I have found them extremely thought-provoking, not only for the religious people, but atheists alike. So I would like to say that we are very anxious to see what you have for your presentation. Now I will introduce you to our audience. Φίλες και φίλοι, καλώς ήρθατε. Πριν ξεκινήσω με την παρουσίαση του δόκτωρα, θέλω να ευχαριστήσω πάρα πολύ την Ειρήνη Μιλωνά που μας έφερε σε επικοινωνία με τον δόκτωρα και την Κάτια Σαρσεμπάγεβα που έκανε τα πάντα για να γίνει αυτό εφικτό. Ευχαριστούμε. Ο Δόκτωρ Γκαρσία είναι κλινικός ψυχολόγος που εξειδικεύεται στην αντιμετώπιση του μετατραυματικού στρες, που μπορεί να έχετε ακούσει σαν PTSD. Είναι επίκουρος καθηγητής στο Τμήμα Ψυχολογίας του Πανεπιστημίου Επιστημών Υγείας στο Σαν Αντόνιο του Τέξας. Έχει κάνει πολλές δημοσιεύσεις για την αντιμετώπιση του μετατραυματικού στρες σε βετεράνους, την ανδρική ψυχολογία, τις εξελικτικές ρίζες του πολέμου, την πολιτική και τη θρησκεία. Σήμερα εδώ θα μας παρουσιάσει την ομιλία του με τίτλο «Άλφα Θεοί, προβάλλοντας τα ένστικτά μας στα ουράνια». Dr. Garcia, I imagine that everything that I just told sounded Greek to you. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I didn't understand any of that, but I thought you said sex on accident. That was nice. It's a delight to be here, and I am told that my name, Hektor, or Hektoras, is in fact Greek and not Trojan, right? Yeah. So here I am. In my work, I have attempted to answer a question. What is God? And I think this is truly one of the most profound of human questions. Some would say that God is love. Some would say that God is beauty. Some would say that God is the ultimate source of goodness in the world. But there is another side of God that must bear reckoning. And that God is a God who inspires the worst of human sufferings. Wars, massacres, witch hunts, inquisitions, crusades. What about the 9/11 attacks or the beheadings perpetrated by ISIS? Women forced to wear burqas or not being allowed to drive or to vote. There are no shortage of historical or current examples. And especially in the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So the sheer suffering caused by religious violence and oppression creates a clear moral urgency to understand these phenomena and to be fiercely honest about what we find. And because God concepts are central to religion, they need to be examined. So we can start by considering several contradictions in God's description. Gods across the pantheon of the world's gods have been described as having qualities that humans do not. Omnipotent, ultimate power, omniscience, knows everything. Immaterial, not made of bodily form like you and I. And everlasting, meaning that this God or these gods never die like you and I. Why then is this God so occupied with territory? Organic beings require territory to extract resources that they need for survival and reproduction, but an omnipotent being shouldn't require those resources. Yet, he defends his lands with terrible violence. Why so preoccupied with displays of submission? Mortal beings in dominance positions require such reassurance because they can be deposed. But an all-powerful being should have no credible threats to his position. Yet this God demands regular submission displays from his subordinates, and if he doesn't receive them, terrible violence. Why so preoccupied with the sexual behavior of his subordinates? An all-powerful, everlasting being doesn't need to reproduce or to compete for reproductive resources like mortals. Yet, he shows immense jealousy, and he spends a great deal of energy policing the sex lives of his followers, and for those who are unfaithful to him, terrible violence. And why, despite the ability to take on any conceivable form in the universe, he tends to look like this. Next slide. You may recognize this one. Or this. Next slide. Mm-hmm. Or this. Next slide. All right. Next slide. So we have known, at least since the ancient Greeks, from those philosophers that first started the pathway to rational thinking right here in this city, that we look into the clouds and we project ourselves. Xenophanes, is that how you say it? Okay. Xenophanes, I will get this. Okay. He said, if oxen and horses and lions had hands and were able to draw with their hands and do the same things as men, horses would draw the shapes of gods to look like horses and oxen, and each would have made the gods' bodies to have the same shapes as they themselves had. Brilliant. But you should know that we also project an ancient legacy of instincts that we inherited from our primate ancestors. And most times we are blind to those instincts. We simply enact them without awareness. And that enactment is the source of countless human sufferings. To correct that blindness, we must understand how our instincts move from apes to men to gods. And we can start that by simple comparative zoology. Next slide. Animals have adaptations that feign larger head size. The head is a good place to have such a display because it's where the teeth are, it's where the eyes are, the windows of intention are. Here we see an adaptation in the frill-neck lizard that has these large skin flaps on either side of his head that he flares out to look more intimidating, to look bigger. This kind of display that you see here is concentrated among males and is made to intimidate predators, but also other males in competition for mates. It is meant to show dominance. Next slide. Male mammals have this adaptation as well. Here we have the African male lion whose fantastic mane makes him look more intimidating. This adaptation is absent in female lions, and male lions who lose competitions with other male lions, they lose their mane. Their hair begins to fall out. Next slide. Primates also have these adaptations. On the upper left, you see the white-eared marmoset with these big ear tufts coming out of his ears to make his head look bigger and more intimidating. To the right of him, the Debraza monkey has the hair display with the big eyebrows and a goatee to make his head look bigger. Below him, the male gelada baboon with his big hair and sideburns. And to the left of him, perhaps the most magnificent example of this among primates, in the male orangutan. He has these extremely large fatty cheek pads and specially adapted cheekbones to hold them, and along with his long red goatee. You look at this guy and you don't want to mess with him, right? He looks scary. So, Men, being good primates, next slide please, also have these adaptations. Is there anybody here with beards? Yes, I see you. Okay, and it tends to be concentrated among fighting men, men who have a stake in maintaining a reputation as tough guys. And you can see it makes it look like the chin starts way lower than it actually does. Now, it's also relevant to contemplate that the same hormone that regulates sexual and aggressive behaviors in men is also responsible for beard growth, which we'll talk about in just a moment, as we would expect if beards play a role in male mate competition. We also see this adaptation in our depictions of God, who in American culture is known as the bearded old man, which has much, much different dominant connotations than, say, the smooth-faced adolescent, right? Which one here looks more dominant to you, right? Next slide. Perhaps not surprisingly, it's also concentrated in the men on the ground who represent that man in the sky. And there are prescriptions for, on the left we have, I think, a Hasidic rabbi, and in the middle, is that one of yours? Is that Greek Orthodox? It is, isn't it? Wow. And on the right, who recognizes that person on the right? Ayatollah Khomeini, right? You see that. They all have long primate threat displays. That's not on accident. In Leviticus, it says, "Thou shalt not round the side growth of your heads, nor harm the edges of your beard." There are prescriptions for cutting off your beard if you're a religious man in the Bible. St. Augustine said that the beard signifies the courageous. Anybody notice anything else about these men that makes their head look bigger besides their beards? Their hats, right? We humans are unique in that we can create technology to naturally exaggerate, to exaggerate our naturally occurring adaptations. And all these men, in addition to wearing big beards, they are also wearing big hats, as you see here. Next slide. This is also concentrated in fighting men. On the left is a Lakota war chief who wore a buffalo headdress specifically to intimidate his rivals in battle. That is the purpose of that headdress. In the middle there, who knows who that man is? It looks like Napoleon's hat, but it's actually General George Washington, who's a war general. And there, on the right, you have a Russian war general who wears a big hat. Notably, the hats that generals wear are larger than their subordinates in the military hierarchy, right? Think about that for a second. All of this occurs underneath our eyes and we don't even notice it, right? Okay, next slide. What's up with this guy? I don't know how he can support this with his neck, but he is not trying to be subtle. This is a Sikh holy man who has the large head display, the beard, and he's walking around carrying a sword just for good measure in case anybody wondered about what his intentions were. All right? Next slide. Here is Pope Benedict and his papal tiara. Now, if there's any doubt that this primate threat display was meant to connote power, during the papal proclamation, I'll read you what it says. It says, "Receive this tiara, adorned with 3 crowns, and know thou art the father of princes and kings, ruler of the world, vicar of our Savior Jesus Christ on earth." So that is meant to connote power. And the papal proclamation also allows popes to depose emperors and allows popes to make princes kiss his feet. This is the closest thing to godlike power that a mortal can have on earth. And it is aided with this large primate threat display. That's what this is. Not only that, when it comes to, when men come to the house of the Lord, when they come to church, they are expected to remove their hats, right? Women, at least in the United States, they don't have the same obligation as we might expect if this was about male dominance and male competition. Men are expected to remove their hats in front of God. We cannot have men showing dominance displays in front of God. Okay. Next slide. We have seen how primates show dominance. How do they show submission? In the material world, size matters, right? Big fish eats little fish. Big chimpanzee beats smaller chimpanzee. And so to show a submissive display, typically subordinate males in particular and females, they shrink down. They shrink down to make themselves appear smaller, to say, I pose no threat, I'm smaller than you. And you can see this with the robust chimpanzee making that display to a more dominant individual who's off screen to the left there. But clearly you can see this chimpanzee is showing a display to show submission. We also have these signs of submission to our dominant male gods, as you can see here. Interestingly, the word for Islam translates to submission. That's what the word Islam means. So the Catholic religion is replete with kneeling rituals, which serves the same purpose. And we see this reference, these references to this behavior throughout the holy text. So, but here is something to contemplate. Size should be irrelevant to an immaterial being who doesn't have a physical form like you and I, who is infinite. Why make a size display to a being who could crush us like ants anyways? Why would this being require that level of reassurance? Okay? Next slide. Here's another example. You look at this one and you understand which one is the dominant one. Which one is the dominant one? The left or the right? Clearly you see that. Next slide. We also do this in the face of dignitaries. We make ourselves appear smaller. It's an old impulse. It's an old way of communication. Next slide. Here's an example of primate submission to the Egyptian god Anubis. Is there any doubt which one is the submissive one in this arrangement here? All right. And we show these kinds of submission to Christ. But again, submission displays should be irrelevant to an omnipotent being that cannot be toppled, and submission displays showing smallness should be irrelevant to an immaterial being. But this is how we project our primate heritage into the ether, into the heavens. Okay. Next slide, please. Kissing is another appeasement response that we see across primate species. And what kissing is believed to do is to emulate infant suckling noises, right? The sound that kissing makes sounds like an infant suckling. And it is designed to connote the idea that I am your offspring, right? Don't hurt me, nurture me. I'm lesser than you, I'm smaller than you, I'm a baby, right? That is what this is designed to do. To trigger a nurturing response rather than attack. And you look at this one and you clearly understand with your own primate social brains which one the dominant one is, right? You see that. Next slide. How about here? It's the exact same response that we have in religion. And if indeed this was tied to connoting infanthood in some way, it should be no surprise that we call our clergy our fathers. All right. Okay, so how else do we show submission in the animal world? Next slide. By surrendering food to a more dominant individual, right? Here's an example of among wolves. You can clearly see which one is dominant. The one on the right is surrendering food to the one on the left to avoid attack. Next slide. Like wolves, primates in hierarchical societies often operate by the same set of rules. Here's a photo of a dominant male chimpanzee who was eating meat from a kill. If you were part of this chimpanzee's troop, you would know instinctively not to come try and take that food from him. Does that make sense? Would you agree with that? You would know. To avoid attack, you would surrender this food to this dominant male chimpanzee. Do we have similar instincts towards our gods? Again, we're usually blind to our instincts, and usually they're right under our noses and we don't see them. Next slide. But religions are full of fasting rituals, such as Ramadan, such as Lent, where we give up food for a dominant male god. The Bible is full of references to this behavior specifically to avoid God's wrath. I'll read you a quote from Deuteronomy. And this is one among so many. It says, I fell prostrate before the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. I ate no bread and drank no water because of the sin that you have committed, doing what was evil in the Lord's sight, and so arousing his anger, surrendering food to avert the wrath of a dominant male god. This behavior is old. It's ancient. So, to avoid God's wrath, we surrender food to him. But not only by fasting. Across religions, believers also tend to send burnt offerings to the Lord. The Bible describes the pious over and over and over surrendering food to the gods. Lamb, oxen, olives, wine, sheep's blood, bread, fruit. By burning it and fanning the smoke to the heavens where we think God resides and is going to receive those foods. It's an old instinct. But again, an omnipotent, immaterial being would not require food to survive. This is about how we write religions based on our own primate brain's design. Next slide. Humans, on the other hand, do require food. And so those puppeteering our gods have been sure to commandeer a greater share of it than the rest of us. Historically, we have given actual food to our religious leaders, but as time evolved and we developed exchanges based on gold or money or other forms of exchange, our religious leaders have asked that we redirect wealth in their direction. And one of the ways they do this is by leveraging our instinctive fear of that dominant male's wrath. There was a tradition in the Catholic Church, for example, where bishops would sell indulgences to avoid time in hell, right? Well, what is hell? Hell is punishment that you receive when you anger the most dominant male in the universe. So by selling these indulgences, these forgivenesses of time in hell, these men, mostly bishops, amassed vast plantations and worked on by serfs, right? Basically slaves. And they ate rich foods. And they drank fine wines. While the poor funneled them whatever they had. In America, we have something similar with our rich televangelists who build these amazing, mansions and have private airplanes off the grocery money of terrified grandmothers who want to avoid time in hell. We have the same thing going on. So we've seen how dominant males, male apes, men, and gods, what they want fear and they want submission. They want food, but they also want something else more than any of these things. Can anybody guess what that is? What do men want? Money, power. Bingo. Next slide, please. Females, of course, right? And lots of them. So, getting into some of the biology here, one important idea is this. Across primate species, males and females engage in different reproductive strategies. Males who can theoretically reproduce with every sexual encounter tend to prefer numbers. And that is not to say that they should or that that's moral or immoral, but it's a fact. We know this, right? Females, on the other hand, have far more limited reproductive capacity. They're limited to periods of fertility, right? They're limited to the span between adolescence and menopause, which all primates undergo. Whereas males can reproduce well into old age, right? So all of this makes females far, far, far more choosier than males. And what this also does, and this is important, is it makes female reproductive resources a scarce commodity, right? And one rule that we know from economics is that when supply goes down, demand increases. And when demand increases, so does competition. And for males, that competition is often violent. Here are two hamadryas baboons fighting over females with these dagger-like canines. Evolutionarily, the role of competition is crucial because in many species, males will hoard females in harems, as we saw in the slide before this one. What this means is that some males will have a dangerously low amount of sex. And to call this a danger is not a play on words. Not having sex evolutionarily is similar to getting killed. It's an evolutionary dead end. In that great competition that we all engage in to perpetuate genes across time, or at least that we're all programmed to engage in. But the question is, does male violence operate in the same way with the same kinds of motivations? Once again, the answer is right under our noses. Here's one example from one of the most violent sports that we have, mixed martial arts. Here you have two male primates squaring off for competition. Note the male on the left with the large primate head display. In this case, it's a traditional headpiece made of sheepskin that the Dagestani tribesmen wore into battle. But at its core, this kind of competition, at its core, beneath everything else, is competition for mates. What evidence do we have of this? I want to show you what we have occurring before every round of the most bloody competition that we have. So, female primates parading around a ring before male primates engage in violent competition. And this is a pattern that we know, all right? Next slide. Here's an example, at least in the United States, of one of the most violent team sports that we engage in. What do we see on the sidelines of that sport? Here's what you see right before that competition. I think my mic's... Right before that competition. Here we go. If this was not an unconscious expression of mate competition, then why are cheerleaders never menopausal women? Why are they not stifled in Victorian outfits up to here and down to the floor? That covers every inch of their bodies. A Martian anthropologist studying human behavior from an outsider would have no problem seeing this, right? But because of instinct blindness, we just, yeah, cheerleaders. We don't think about the implications of this, right? So male humans compete for females, and in sports they do it violently. But do they prefer numbers of females like baboons and other primates? Well, as it happens, there's a huge research literature on this subject. Research finds that men strongly prefer casual sex more, men masturbate more, men fantasize about group sex far more than women. There were a set of really ingenious studies that had attractive undergraduates walk around their university and approach the opposite sex and quickly, within maybe a minute of conversation, offer casual sex. The researchers found that a whopping 75% of men said, yeah, okay, let's go. Let's go back to your apartment. Guess what percentage of the women accepted that request? Guess what percentage? Half? Zero. None of the women consented to that. 75% of the men said, yeah, and 0% of the women consented to that offer, right? Now, while this is not often part of popular conversation, I tell you who understands our mating psychology very well, and that is marketing executives. Marketing executives know our evolutionary psychology. Let's play the next slide, please. Say the company that makes Axe deodorant spray makes millions upon millions upon millions every year. They know our psychology. Who could deny that? Now, what about God? What about God? Have we really projected this to this pedestrian, this animalistic want for sex, and lots of it, into the clouds, onto a being who doesn't reproduce because he never dies, that is not made of physical form like you and I? Does that God want women? Apparently he does, and lots of them. In this photo here, we have 92 women completely devoted to their male God. And devoted sexually too, right? They have devoted their virginity to this male God who has an interest in their virginity. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of more of women just like them across religions. But is all this devotion to God really sexual? The Greek god Zeus was a notorious womanizer, right? He had multiple affairs with humans and goddesses alike, right? As one example. Next slide. The god Krishna, it is said, had relations with 16,000 maidens in the forests of India. 16,000. And the Holy Bible is full of references to God's sexuality. The bride of Christ, for example, is a dogma where the soul of both men and women is made female so that the soul can more easily sexually submit to God. But once again, an omnipotent being that never dies, that is immaterial, and that is not of bodily form like you and I, should have no interest or need for sex. But here's the thing, with all of this desire for numbers of mates, the male to female ratio in most primate species is roughly 50-50. And as we talked about before, some males will hoard females, right? Which makes that ratio even smaller for the remaining males. So how do males contend with this? They go to war. They go to war. This is an example of robust chimpanzees going on patrols. And if you've ever seen videos of this, I highly recommend looking up. It's eerie. So the normally boisterous, loud, hooting chimpanzees, they go quiet. And like they all know what the mission is. And then they single file through the jungle around the edges of their territory, and a gate that is reserved specifically for war. And if they find lone members from the rival troop or a smaller number, they attack them viciously. They attack them, they kill them. So when that happens, they go on a raid again, maybe a few days later and a few days later. What eventually happens is they will kill all the males from the rival troop and absorb that troop's females, increasing their reproductive success through war. Chimpanzees do this. Do men have a similar motivation for war? Hunter-gatherer groups will regularly conduct raids against the rival tribe, and they'll kill all the men, kill all the boys, and they'll capture the women as their spoils of war. So research has found that up to 30% of men in hunter-gatherer tribes are killed by this kind of warfare. And not only that, but the archaeological record suggests that this behavior is very old, because what we find over and over and over are massacre sites with the notable absence of bones of reproductive age females. You find bones of men, you find bones of older women, but reproductive age females, you don't find those bones, which suggests that they weren't killed, but they were taken captive, right? So we can see this dark impulse in the modern era with modern armies, in which wartime rape is startlingly common. Press it again. During the Bosnian genocide, there were estimated 50,000 rapes. During the Rwandan genocide, 250,000. In the Congo, 400,000. When the Japanese army invaded China during World War II, 800,000 rapes. And when the Red Army invaded Berlin in World War II, an estimated 2 million women were raped. All right. Now, what happens when you create God as a dominant male primate? Next slide. He operates by the same rules. Here is a command that God made to Moses. Moses passed that command on to his men. It says in Numbers, "Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourself every girl who has never slept with a man." Next slide. Here's another one from Deuteronomy. "When you go to war against your neighbors, and the Lord God delivers them into your hands, and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and you are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife." Right? So if this were a relic of the past, that would be one thing. But it is not. Our instincts have not gone away. And we see these behaviors among contemporary groups of men like ISIS and Boko Haram, who have gone to war specifically to capture sexual slaves in the combat theater. And at the command of their dominant male god, who wants that for his men, who understands that, because he has that very same impulse. So this is what happens with the backing of this god, with the backing of the most powerful male ally in the entire universe. Men gain confidence in battle. And if they get killed in the combat theater, they're still afforded virgins in the afterlife, right? So here's, in this photo, you see a primate male alliance in ISIS. ISIS tore into northern Iraq, slaughtered men and boys by the thousands, raped the women and girls, and they burned those women alive in cages who would not submit as sexual slaves. Burned them alive. But in the end, these unspeakable cruelties were not committed by gods. They're committed by men. Men with instincts that they arrive at through millions of years of mate competition. And you know, the truth is, we would still have these instincts if it weren't for religion. We would still have them, right? But religion gives these men greater willingness to take risks, right? And it comes with something very dangerous, and that is the inability to question that God, right? On the penalty of death. So one thing we know from history is that when the ability to question is taken from us, all manners of human cruelty are possible. Next slide. So what can we do? We question everything. We question everything, and we protect our right to question everything. Bottom line, we must maintain a wall between church and state. Allowing even the slightest breach is a dangerous mistake, and we're still fighting for that back in my home country, in the United States. We're still fighting to keep that wall. We must also ensure that these evolutionary sciences have a protected place in the conversation about who we are, because they're very honest and they're very telling. And without that knowledge, we are far more likely to simply enact our worst impulses without understanding them. But with this knowledge, we can identify the alleged preferences of a dominant male god for what they really are. And maybe then we can decide for ourselves whether we wish to give the most brutal aspects of our evolved psychology, our most brutal instincts, religious privilege, or if we should leave them in our ancestors' past where they belong. Thank you so much for listening.
As I said, thought-provoking. Now, Professor will accept questions. If someone has an issue of asking in English, I can do the translation. First question, yeah?
Thank you. That was very interesting and enlightening. I'm wondering how human sacrifice fits to the sacrificial part of what you described, because offering food, that's one thing, but offering one's own children, how does this fit with the whole picture?
It's assuming God wants to eat children, right? And that also has to do with something called costly signaling theory. right? So many animals cooperate with their kin, right, with their genetic relatives because they share genes along with them, right? It's easier to cooperate with your kin. You know, there's a thought experiment like, who would you be more likely to save from a burning building, even at some risk to yourself? Your child? A third cousin? A total stranger? Your dog? Your goldfish? Right? You're probably going to, your willingness to do that would probably be in direct proportion to the amount of genes you share, right? Because at least if you die in the process, your genes carry on in the person you save, like your child, right? But we humans are really good at extending cooperation beyond our genetic kin, and one of the ways we do that is by showing costly signals of commitment. We don't like people who cheat on a reciprocal exchange. If I save your life in battle, I really want to be sure that you're going to save my life in battle too. If I put my life on line to protect you, I want to make sure that you don't run away when we're getting attacked. So we show signals of commitment to make that more certain. Scarring rituals, right? A lot of tribes have scarring rituals where we scar ourselves to show, okay, if I'm going to go to this trouble, I'm sincere. I'm not going to back out. I'm going to put myself through this pain, right? Militaries have things like that, initiation rites. Well, sometimes it's giving up something that you really love, right? My show of commitment to God is to give my only son, right? And in fact, God makes that same commitment to us, right? Gives us his son, according to Scripture. But in the end, it's an empty gesture, right? Because God ostensibly can produce 1 billion sons by speaking a word, right? And it's at no cost to him. That would be a great cost to us. So I think that's a way to show loyalty to God, to secure God's favor, to secure God's alliance, right? I'm doing something. I'm making a sacrifice for you, so you know that I'm loyal to you. I think at heart that's what that is. Kind of a long explanation for that question, but I hope it makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was interesting what he said about male having hair to show that they're bigger, etc. And I remember the same happened with Delilah and Samson, where Delilah cut Samson's hair, and by that he lost his power. And I was wondering, maybe, what do you think, why do you think women in church, in Islam, but in Greece as well, where we have Orthodox church, are obliged to cover their hair? Yeah. Do you think they're connected?
No, I think there are different mechanisms involved. You know, for men, a big evolutionary concern is cuckoldry, right? Cuckoldry comes from the cuckoo bird, right? You've heard of the cuckoo birds. The cuckoo bird is this bird that has this notorious practice of laying its eggs in another species' nest. And so that bird, often a much smaller species, has to take all these risks and expend all this energy caring for offspring that isn't theirs. That's dangerous evolutionarily, right? That is potentially a dead end if you take care of offspring that isn't yours. That's a big fear for men. Men want, you know, paternal certainty, right? Because a woman always knows if a child is hers, right? A man can never really know. So I think a lot of times men require shows of chastity, right? Shows of, you know, that you're not available, that you're not advertising yourself. And I think that is why all of God's women cover themselves from head to toe. Why do God's women have to wear a nun's habit in robes and not show part of their body? Well, hair is a sign of beauty among women. And so I think we're saying by that you know, our God is concerned that his women are going to show sexual availability by letting their hair down. But again, it's a projection onto God of our very pedestrian concerns.
Thank you so much.
That's my thought.
Doctor, thank you for the conversation. I have a question about what's the science part in all of this. For example, if you think about that man believes in a God and God with his sense, and Christianity and Islam and all of the religions does not allow clearly man to advocate science. For example, St. Augustine said once that don't trust mathematicians.
Don't what? I'm sorry.
Don't trust the mathematicians and the astronomers. And all of them, in the early years of Christianity, were all killed. What's the main wall that science provides psychologically between men, people, humans, and God?
Powerful men and powerful gods have always been afraid of our ability to question. They've always been afraid of knowledge, because when a populace is informed, they have power. They can coordinate action. They can challenge power inequities, right? When you take away a populace's ability to question, they're left impotent, right? But with the ability to question, you can question many things. You can question, why are you on top and I am not? Why do I have to give you money to save myself from hell? And why not the other way around? You can start asking questions. So I think knowledge is very much related to power. And I think that's why science has been so much the target of religion. And I think that's why we should always have, science should always have a protected place in policy and conversations about humanity. So yeah, it's an enemy. It's an enemy. That's why the churches books have always been an enemy, right? Banning books, burning books, allowing only one book, or the clergy being the only ones who are allowed to read the book and interpret the book. Pardon? Don't translate the books. Only I can read you the books. I think there's an idea that, once you read the Bible from cover to cover, you're more likely to become atheist because you see what's inside there. Really.
That's how many of us became atheists.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, the Pew Research has found that atheists have more biblical knowledge than most religious people in the United States. More religious knowledge. So yeah, knowledge is threatening. Yeah, good question. My pleasure.
Congratulations for your excellent lecture.
Thank you.
A lecture that went very, very deep. One question. In the sentence Alpha God, what is the meaning of the Greek letter Alpha?
Is this a test on my knowledge of Greek?
No, of course not.
Alpha God, because he's the alpha. He's the alpha male. He's on top. He is the most potent, most powerful, biggest, dominant God, Alpha.
The first letter of the alphabet.
The first letter of the alphabet, and it also connotes the most dominant member of a rank-ordered species, like the alpha male chimpanzee, the alpha male wolf, something like that. It connotes power.
Okay.
Thank you for your lecture. It was delicious.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. I was very interested to hear about the oppression.
Oppression?
Yes.
Many women are.
Yes, because I think this is a very important capital of this power that the church is imposing to us. And as I understood, God is a male thing, only a male thing, because women were not present in or present as very, very submissive.
Right. It's evident that women were not writing scripture in the biblical era or before then.
They're almost not existing.
Yeah.
And what interests me in particular is the oppression that religion and God, this thing that they put on your heads, on our minds, especially to children.
Yes.
If you have to say.
Yes. Yeah. Children are vulnerable, right? They are subject to what you teach them and to believe what you teach them. But yes, indeed. The Alpha God is an impressive God, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor, for this opportunity you gave to us. I have a specific question. Why are religions obsessed with virginity in women, not only in the terms of sex, but in other divine forms? For example, the mother of Jesus is virgin, even after she gave birth to Jesus.
Yes. Well, it all comes down to paternal certainty, right? Men are concerned about paternal certainty. Men want to make sure that the offspring that they're caring for is theirs. And that's one thing about humans, is that our offspring spend an inordinate amount of time in dependency, right? Some species, wildebeest, the mother plops out this baby wildebeest in the savannah. 10 minutes later, it's running with the herd, right? Not so with human children. It takes so much time and provisioning and effort and care and protection. And men, in addition to, perpetrating a lot of unspeakable cruelties, a role that they've played throughout our history is by provisioning and taking care of children. That's a fact that we know. We cannot overlook that. So men have an incentive to ensure that their efforts are supporting their offspring, not the other guys, right? And so we project that onto God. Like, God prefers virgins, right? So God prefers Mary to be a virgin, even though, an omnipotent God wouldn't need a virgin because he'd already know. I mean, he would already know, right? And so why would he be concerned? He'd already know if it was his, and he shouldn't care. He could provision 1 billion children at no cost, right? So we project this all into the ether along with everything else.
How can I help Stelios, Katya, to don't feel that way, to don't do the same motivo?
I'm sorry, tell me a little bit more how to
help Stelios, Katya, to don't feel press from the alpha male and God.
You could reject the religion. You could think for yourself. It's hard when you're in it. But I don't know. Intellectual liberty is huge in all of this, right? When you understand the inner workings, then you're better equipped to make informed decisions, right? So education, yeah, that helps. We don't have to abide by it. There are some places where you do, right? And that is the scary part to me. There are some places where you have to profess belief on the penalty of death, right? And that is something we must protect against, right? But fortunately, we're not in that situation where you live or where I live at the moment, but we should be cautious about that.
Hector, two things. I think there might be a paradox. This country here has a state religion. The US has a wall between state and religion, Jefferson's comment.
Yes.
How come there are more fervently religious in the US than here?
Oh, that's a great question.
The next issue is that there's a perception that the state has no business in the bedrooms of people. How come religion has? In form of contraception, that HIV is evil, but not as evil as prophylactics that might prevent you from getting it.
Right. Yeah, well, underneath all that are these same motives of mate competition, right? I mean, if we allow prophylactics, that could allow premarital sex or extramarital sex. And, I think men are instinctively programmed to feel uncomfortable with that, right? If we're operating just by our instincts. But yes, I mean, the religions have more power than I think they should in the United States, even though we have erected a so-called wall. We're constantly fighting breaches in attempts to dismantle that wall. religion, the way we're set up is that religions are a very, very wealthy and powerful lobbying force in the United States, and I think that's problematic. They're not taxed, so they can amass a lot of wealth. It's problematic. It's not a perfect system, and it's something that, you know, we got to keep fighting to keep that, to maintain that wall. So.
Right, and since I don't see another hand, I'll give you my last question. From what I've seen and your presentation in general, since antiquity, it seems that in the past we had Zeus, we had Thor, we had Ra, but nowadays the Abrahamic religions have spread throughout the world. Do you think that this happened just because the people who support them beat in battle all the rest, or because they projected more of an alpha god? People in the end decided to join them and leave the old religions that had also women figure and
yeah, that's a terrific question. I do unpackage that in the book, and mostly I tell a history as told by Robert Wright, who talks about that phenomenon. I mean, what an alpha god does is it allows fractious states to consolidate power, right? If you have one state that is worshiping one god and another one worshiping another god and another one worshiping another god, there can be dissent, right? And so I'm not following your god into battle, I'm following my god into battle who has a different thought, right? So consolidating under one god was a way to consolidate military power, which was very crucial during the biblical age where the Fertile Crescent was just a hotbed for war and slaughter. So I think it has that kind of martial utility, right, to operate under one god, and that was part of it. And I think also, I personally think that God is intuitive to our psychology, right? We're more likely to submit to a God that is asking us to submit in the primate ways of old that we know instinctively. So I think that was part of it.
Dr. Γκαρσία, thank you very, very much for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που παρευρεθήκατε σήμερα. Δύο μόνο ενημερώσεις να κάνω. Η επόμενη εκδήλωση της Ένωσης Αθέων, όχι ακριβώς εκδήλωση δικιά μας, αλλά θα είμαστε στο Pride στις 15 Ιουνίου, για όποιον θέλει να μαζί από κοντά. Επίσης, επειδή είδα και πάρα πολλά καινούργια πρόσωπα, αν κάποιος θέλει να γίνει μέλος, οτιδήποτε, ο Ζώης είναι ο ταμείας μας, μπορεί να μιλήσει εκεί πέρα. Σας ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ.